You know, I think we can argue that the increase in opioids that we've seen with Medicaid expansion might be unintended, but I don't think we can argue that it's unforeseen. You can argue causation and correlation all day long, but if Medicaid population was using opioids at a greater amount than the non-Medicaid population before the expansion, if you give Medicaid more money, you're going to see the same thing, and more money will simply exacerbate something. So if they were using prescribing opioids at twice the rate before, maybe they're still doing it at twice the rate. So Medicaid expansion didn't cause prescribers to prescribe it more, but if they're already doing it and you fuel it with more money, you're going to get more of a problem. So I think it's very predictable. And if you throw more money at Medicaid now and you don't have rules on prescribing or you don't have significant changes on prescribing, you're going to get more of the problem. I agree with some of the issues on Suboxone and replacement and rehab. All of those things would be good. But if you don't fix the rules on prescribing, and normally I would say this is a state problem and we shouldn't be involved, but all the money's federal now. So it's 100% federal on the Medicaid expansion. So I guess one question I would have for the chairman is, do you have any ideas or thoughts about, we want to do problem solving about how we would change the prescribing habits other than just suggestions? I think suggestions aren't enough actually here.
Well, again, I'm not the witness here, but it's actually what I want coming out of this hearing is give that thought process. One of the reasons I've written a letter to HHS. Let's get the information, let's get the data, and then work with experts. What can we do to change the prescribing methodology, those types of procedures so that we stop overprescribing and we can actually effectively address this?
Mr. Adolphson, do you have any ideas on how we'd change prescribing habits through law?
Thank you, Senator. There are a couple things that are already in law that I think states aren't using well. I know Maine wasn't when we arrived there. Prescription monitoring in the Medicaid program. There's a program called Lock-In where you restrict a Medicaid member to one pharmacy, one doctor, one prescriber. Those programs not used very effectively or not used extensively in states. There's somewhat of an obsession with access in the Medicaid departments around the country, I think, and so it seems that folks are sometimes shy to do things that might restrict someone from that access. But I think the lock-in program is good. There are other controls, certainly. There's a drug utilization review program that's already in Medicaid, again, but not being used well. The bottom line is the money flows through Medicaid. And people, I think, view Medicaid as more than it is. It's really, as somebody, another witness said, a passive payer. And so they're not looking at a person holistically. And, causation, I've seen it line by line. I've seen a person access their welfare benefit, and a couple days later, we see them in the data with an overdose. And that's causation. And I think we can find that level of detail if you look at the states, but it needs more control.
And I think, though, overall, we're going to need a much more dramatic change in how we prescribe. I mean, Sam Quinones in his book talks about that used to be physicians were worried about addiction, and in chronic pain, we didn't tend to use opioids as much. And some of this came from Big Pharma, trying to change patterns of prescription, came from within the pain community, and it came from distorting one study that talked about inpatient people on opioids that had really nothing to do with outpatient treatment and was misused to say that we could use opioids in an outpatient without any consequences. So I think it has to be very, very dramatic, and I think it's going to have to actually be in law. As much as I'm for freedom of the physician to prescribe stuff, if it's federal money, we're going to have to oversee the federal money, and we're going to have to figure out a way to say, maybe other than terminal patients and a few other people, it needs to be something else. And you talk about expense. I've had a lot of experience with pain myself. Ibuprofen, I think, works in a fabulous way and is very cheap. But we've convinced patients that it's not good unless it's prescription, unless it's good stuff, unless it's a narcotic, it's somehow not a good painkiller. But ibuprofen is a very potent painkiller, particularly in higher doses. But something dramatic is going to have to happen. And I promise you, if we just throw more money at this, the problem will get worse. We have one county in Appalachia, and we've gotten rid of the really bad doctors. We have done some of the controls that the states have tried. And last year, I think it was 20,000 people got 2.8 million doses of opioids in one county. 150 doses per man, woman, and child. And this is after we've spent years in Kentucky really rooting out the bad doctors and doing some good things, and yet it's still an enormous problem. So I think what we have to look at, Mr. Chairman, I think we have to look at the money. We're in charge of the money for the Medicaid expansion, and we're in charge of a good chunk of the Medicaid program. We need to put in place some rules on this. But it's going to have to be dramatically changing this. I'm not so sure OxyContin should be used for chronic pain at all. So, I mean, we really probably need to get away from that, but we can't have suggestions. What we tend to do up here is we write into law suggestions, and they never happen. This is a real epidemic, and we're fools to sit up here and say causation versus correlation. People are dying in Medicaid, and we're giving it away for $3. If we can't get over the fact that you give people free medication and then we overprescribe it, that there's going to be a problem, we have to have significant rules in place. And Mr. Schock, you mentioned something about the payment with Medicaid, whether or not there could be more rules attached to how we pay people with for opioids that might lead to some improvement. Do you want to expound on that?
Sure. So, in addition to, I said that I ordinarily it's the impoverished that walk through the courtroom doors, but I've also prosecuted, a prominent medical doctor in my community for committing Medicaid fraud. And what that illustrated to me was how susceptible Medicaid patients are to being victims of doctors that are committing Medicaid fraud themselves. I want to say, as a whole, I believe the medical community is well-intentioned and is seeking out a healthier community. But as we all know, it only takes one bad actor in a community to really exploit an already dangerous situation. And so what we were seeing was that this doctor's Medicaid patients, his prescription practices were far different than his prescription practices with non-Medicaid patients. And due to how vulnerable that segment of the community is, whether that's through drug addiction, criminal behavior, what we were finding was they were being treated differently. And I think if you talk to any prosecutor in any part of the country, they're going to tell you all their defendants, they always have that one go-to doctor that they seek out. We call them pill mills in law enforcement because that's really how we view them. By regulating what the doctors are doing, and just like you, I am all for freedom in the medical community. However, I think we need to hold doctors more accountable. Are their prescriptions in line with the treatment program? As a prosecutor, it's very difficult to go after a medical doctor that's committing Medicaid fraud because they are insulated under this treatment of care defense. However, what is the difference between a doctor that is prescribing pills that are not necessary than the person that's dealing heroin on the street? They're both making a profit by selling something that is not needed. And so I think that we need to hold our medical community to a higher standard as it relates to the egregious prescription practices. I think you're absolutely correct, Senator, that we have to regulate.
We will make America great again.